Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Podcast Done For You, where we're going to give you some vital information to help your podcasts get up and running smoothly. And of course, we remind you that if you would just like your podcast done for you, come and talk to us because that's what we do. A podcast done for you. Now, what I want to talk to you today about is interviewing. There are really some important techniques that you need to master if you are going to have an interview style podcast. Now, when I say an interview style podcast, that could be a regular to and fro between two people who are the regular people involved in a podcast, or it could literally be that you're interviewing a guest each time. Now, really what you have to remember is that this is an art form, okay? It does not necessarily come naturally to everybody. It is something that you have to practice, and you have to work out the style that you want to use for each one. So spend a bit of time, first of all, and watching some of your favorite interview style programs, be it on other podcasts, be it on radio, and of course on television. There are a number of techniques that you can see over the years that have worked better for some and different for others. So there's no absolute right or wrong to it, but it is about the art of being prepared. That's where you need to start from. So before you even worry about the technique that you're going to use during an interview, firstly, do your research. Now, just because you're an expert in your area does not necessarily mean that you can simply wing it. Now, there are certain interviews where you maybe can do that because you're treating it as a conversation with someone who's completely new to you and you just want to be the inquisitive person and ask what anybody would ask. But even then, you need to have your audience in mind. So the first part of the preparation for an interview is to understand who the audience is, because that will dictate the kind of questions that you ask and the way that you ask those questions. So if your audience is, for example, if your audience is adults versus parent versus children, right, there's a completely different approach, and that's stating the obvious. But there's also the more technical ones, the people who have a much greater knowledge of things versus those people who want something a little bit more plain and simple. So there are lots of things to consider when you look at the art of interviewing. Now, one of the things then, once you've mastered who your audience is going to be, is to, in order to formulate any questions, as I said, you need to do your research. Find out about the person that you are interviewing. For the moment, I'm going to assume that it is a guest, someone new to the program. Now, they may not be new to you. You may have met them before, but they are new as far as you being in a situation where you're interviewing them is concerned. So you should do your research. Find out what you can about them. Find out the things, not so much about, well, to an extent, what they may have talked about on other podcasts, but then perhaps look at how are you going to take it somewhere different. You don't just want to record the same interview that people could hear on another podcast. You want to have your own take on it. What is your spin? How are you going to inject your own area of expertise into it? So step first is do your research, look on LinkedIn, of course, and dig a little deep on any podcasts that they've been on. You know, have they written any books? Have they done any presentations? They might have done a TED talk or something of that nature, or they might have appeared somewhere at a conference. Then, of course, look at their website. Get as much information as you can to find those key areas that you want to focus on that are going to be relevant to your audience, and try and find some unique perspective to bring to it. Remember, you have to inject your own stories in order to build your own credibility, because simply interviewing someone just for the sake of it may not necessarily be what you need to raise your credibility in your business. Now, again, there are certain podcasts where it is just about interviewing someone, and I have that to a certain degree with my Biz Bites podcast that hopefully many of you have heard. That is really because I have as a job, as a role that I offer to people, hosting. So me hosting and doing interviews with a variety of different guests does actually work for me. But again, I'm also trying to interview people with a perspective of an audience that is a business leader's audience. So I'm asking questions based on that and based also on trying to inject some of my marketing expertise that I've accumulated over 30 odd years. So that's where I focus the Biz Bites program. The question is, how are you going to focus yours? So once you've done a little bit of research, the key is really working out those key areas. Start with that. Start from the beginning and go, what are the key specific areas that you want to focus the interview on? Remember, you can't necessarily cover everything. Now, there are some podcasts out there, of course, that can go for 3 hours and great for those. But I'm betting that if you're watching this, that is not your plan. You're probably looking at anything from a 15-minute to a 35-minute podcast. That seems to be about the norm. So in order to cover that, you want to make sure that your interview is going to be kept in line, because you also want to minimize the amount of editing that you have to do afterwards. The more editing, the more time, the more effort, the more cost. And not only that, the less likely you are to repeat the exercise and do more of those things in the future because they become too intensive. Plus, that whole idea of leaving things on the cutting room floor is an art in itself, and you don't just want to edit for the sake of it. The whole, I think, beauty of a podcast is, and this is where the interview comes in the style, is that it is a great conversation. People get to listen into a conversation that they believe is also relevant to them. So that's the key question for you to answer as well, is where do you want to take the conversation, and making sure that it is your audience is kept in mind as you're going about that. So as you find the sort of topics of interest, you want to shape the interview so that there's some logic to it as well, because you don't want to start here and then suddenly go back down here and over to there, because that makes it really difficult to listen to. There is a sequence. And if you think about any great story, and that's what an interview is, it's a collection of stories, but ultimately it is one story that is your podcast. There is a beginning, middle, and end. So work out where the end is. Where do you want to finish up? If there is two things that you need to work out in an interview, I believe it is what's the first question and what's the last question, because you need to know how you're going to wrap things up and tie it all up together. But certainly, as far as the introduction is concerned, get that key question in that is going to start opening things up, because often more questions will follow. You don't need to necessarily write them all down. Now, again, depends on how good you are at interview techniques. I think the best interviewers that I've seen over the years personally are those where they're not looking at any notes particularly. I speak of a couple of English interviewers that I particularly admire. One's like Michael Parkinson and Graham Norton. Both of them are not really Michael Parkinson certainly didn't, and Graham Norton rarely refers to notes. Now, they do have notes. They are well researched, and they do have researchers, of course, but they know the subject matter and they know the things they want to talk about. And that's the point, is that if you know some key areas, those questions hopefully will come to you, because you should be naturally inquisitive and be able to inject yourself, because that's the other key to the interview, is it's not just a series of questions, because you are not a TV journalist. That's not the role that you're playing. The role that you're playing is that you are a peer. You are seeking some expertise from one of your peers, but also wanting to inject your own expertise, your own stories, and your own credibility into it. So don't be afraid to expand when you ask a question. You don't have to simply say to them, well, tell me how you approach X, because in doing that, you're not giving yourself an opportunity to add a little bit of you. Add what you think in response to whatever the person has been talking about as part of the whole equation. Now, being prepared is one thing, actually doing it in front of the camera, or even if there's no camera on and it's just audio, is actually can be another thing. I get it. You get nervous, you get lost. So you need to have a real sense, a real map. As I said, you want a beginning and an end, but you want a bit of a map in your mind or just written down on a note that you can glance at really easily, not read, but glance at really easily to remind what are the key topics that you want to cover. Now, also, remember that it's an authentic, natural conversation. So with that in mind, it is quite possible that you get to a point where you realize you can't cover everything. You have a decision to make in the interview. Do you cut things short in order to cover all of those different topics, or do you stay with one topic and keep getting more information out of there with a view that there will be another time for another interview on all of those things that you didn't cover? I personally tend to favor that approach, because when you try to cover everything, you don't get into the depth and the detail that you really want to. And ultimately, the great thing about an interview and a podcast are those little gems that you pluck out. I think we all have great interviews that we possibly remember over the years. I have one that I am almost positive that none of you have heard. And I just want to relay it to you because it gives you a bit of a sense of the idea of what happened with research and when you ask things that are a little bit unexpected. So I worked for many years in radio and as a producer for a program led by John Kerr. And John, if you happen to still be watching and listening to this, fantastic, and you and I are going to catch up for lunch very soon. But John did one of the best interviews that I can ever remember happening, and with a well-known person, and it's actually not that important who that person was. But the point was that he found a line of questioning to ask him about that wasn't about the latest book, the latest tour, the latest whatever it was. It was actually about a starting point, about something interesting that had happened in his life that had not been spoken about previously, or at least not for a long time. It was, John found it from a book and it was a passing note, but it was an interesting way of getting into a conversation that was quite different, to the point where at the end of the interview, the person being interviewed thanked John not only for the interview, but for doing something different and unexpected and really enjoying the conversation. That interview, I know, was replayed, I can't tell you how many times over the next 2 or 3 years because it was so in demand. Now, it was at a point where there wasn't a podcast, so people couldn't really go and replay it in their own time. But that is the point, that's the great thing about a podcast interview, that if you've got a lot of those gold nuggets and you've got a different approach, then you're going to get people who want to go back and listen again and again and again, and they want to tell more people about it. So the last thing that I would say to you about the art of an interview is that you do want it to be a conversation. Unless you are doing a serious investigative style podcast, and I'm betting that most of you watching and listening are not going to be doing that, then the trick really is to simply be having a meaningful conversation with someone with your audience very much in mind, so that the content that you are extracting from the person is targeted at the people that you want to be listening, so that they're sitting on the other end going, wow, that's me that they're talking to, because that's you who I'm talking to right now. And I want you to keep that in mind as you do that. The other thing too is that practice and practice and practice. You're going to get better at interviews as you go along, but there is an absolute art to being able to do it. And I think that that's something that you should all keep in mind. Many podcasts can do better with an anchor. So that's someone that is tying it all together, that is making sure the introductions, the endings, that is making sure there's a bit of a flow to the conversation and can keep things moving, can add a lot of value to your podcast. They can add value also in the sense that you then move away from being the anchor to being a peer, to being another person being interviewed. You might be the only person being interviewed, in fact, and that is the case with several of the podcasts that I've done. But even if you have a guest on as well, if you've got an anchor there, you're immediately on their same level. You're not playing the interviewer. And remember the don'ts, okay? Here are the don'ts. Do not tell the people what your questions are going to be. People pre-prepare and take it on the journey that they want to take it on. Let it go on the journey that you want to go on. Secondly, and most importantly, do not send them a list of questions as a pre-recorded voiceover that they then record their voice answering and then send it back. I've heard a few people do that as a podcast, and it is absolutely horrible to listen to. Make it a natural flowing conversation. And like I said, if you want some help, then reach out to us, because Podcast Done For You is all about doing it for you. We do anchor the program. I anchor programs for people so that they are the experts, so they don't have to worry about the interview side, because they're the people being interviewed along the way. I hope you've got some great content out of this. Please subscribe below. We'd love you to not miss an episode of this. And of course, as I said to you, if you would just like to have a podcast done for you, then contact us. All the information is in the show notes below. I look forward to your company on the next episode of Podcast Done For You, the show.